Okay, let's go. Number 1. Hoia-Baciu Forest, 1968. You're Alexandru Sift, a military biologist working for the Romanian state, and you're standing at the edge of a clearing that shouldn't exist. The trees around you are wild and dense in the way that Transylvanian forests have been since before written records. But in front of you, the forest simply stops. A circle in the earth, roughly half a hectare across, holds grass and wildflowers and nothing else. Not one tree, not one sapling, not even a root crossing the boundary line. You've been running soil tests for 3 weeks. The earth inside the clearing is fertile, chemically identical to the forest floor surrounding it on every side. There is no missing nutrient, no geological reason for the line. The circle simply refuses to grow trees. You lift your Geiger counter. The needle spikes. This is the Hoia-Baciu forest, and Alexandru Sift's photographs from that visit became the first documented evidence that something in this forest resisted normal scientific explanation. Sift wasn't a paranormal enthusiast. He was a trained researcher working for the Romanian military, sent to study the forest's unusual animal behavior. What he found instead launched decades of state-funded investigation that governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain quietly monitored and never publicly acknowledged. The forest covers roughly 250 hectares of woodland on the western edge of Cluj-Napoca, the cultural capital of Transylvania. It takes its name from a shepherd called Baciu, who allegedly vanished inside it centuries ago, along with a flock of 200 sheep. No trace of him or the animals was ever recovered. Locals had been avoiding the deeper sections for generations before Sift arrived with his instruments. What Sift documented, and what subsequent researchers confirmed through repeated visits, reads like a precise inventory of the physically unexplained. People entering the central zone without any prior knowledge of the forest's reputation develop geometric rashes on their skin within hours, not diffuse irritation, but defined shapes, appearing and fading without dermatological explanation. Electronic equipment fails in specific, reproducible zones. A German public broadcasting crew entered in the 1990s with professional cameras. Within a 30-meter radius of the clearing, the cameras failed. The moment the crew stepped back outside that radius, they functioned normally. They replicated the effect before their equipment failed for good. In 2010, documents released under Romania's post-communist transparency laws showed that the Securitate had maintained an active file on Hoia-Baciu from 1968 through 1973. The file recorded military-funded research, producing results that nobody in the file appeared to know how to categorize. Electromagnetic readings inside the clearing exceeded background levels by margins, with no local geological basis. Soil composition matched the surrounding forest exactly. Aerial heat signature surveys recorded a persistent thermal anomaly centered on the clearing with no identified source. The file ends in 1973. Whatever conclusion the researchers reached is either classified beyond what the disclosure laws reached, or it was destroyed before they took effect. American interest surfaced when the CIA's declassified Cold War research files, released through Freedom of Information requests in 2017, contained a brief line identifying Hoia-Baciu as a site of documented anomalous electromagnetic and biological phenomena of interest. No analysis, no conclusion. Just the acknowledgement that the site exists in their records, which places it in a category of locations that government agencies find worth tracking and have never found worth explaining. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. The circular clearing has a geological origin, a subsurface rock formation, a buried bog, something that inhibits root growth from below. Reported symptoms are psychosomatic. Electromagnetic readings reflect normal variation. The Securitate closed the file because the research reached unremarkable conclusions. But 5 independent university laboratories have analyzed the clearing's soil since 1990. None found any subsurface feature that would account for the growth boundary. Children brought to the clearing by parents who described it as an ordinary picnic site, with no suggestion of anything unusual, reported the same specific physical effects. The electromagnetic readings have been reproduced by Romanian, German, and American teams using different instruments across 3 decades. The thermal anomaly appears in aerial data that predates technology sophisticated enough to be influenced by expectation. The Securitate didn't maintain a 5-year military research program because they were measuring anxiety. They were measuring something physical. What that something is, Romania's current government has not been asked to answer in public. Access to the clearing remains restricted after dark under a municipal ordinance that states no reason. What exactly did 5 years of Securitate research find in that clearing? Why does the thermal anomaly persist with no identified heat source? And what happened to the conclusions that should have followed? From Romania's unexplained clearing, we travel east to the base of the world's most iconic volcano, where Japan's government has spent decades managing a forest that does something no agency wants to discuss in plain language. Number 2. Aokigahara Forest. Yamanashi Prefecture, 2003. You're a detective with the prefectural police, and October means Aokigahara. Your unit has run the monthly sweep for 3 consecutive years. This year's body recovery total will reach 105. The prefectural government stopped publishing annual statistics 4 years ago because the numbers kept rising and the numbers kept making international news. Your equipment checklist includes a GPS unit, a radio, a pole for testing ground stability, and rope for the sections where canopy is too dense for satellite signal. Your GPS shows your position as of 8 minutes ago. The compass has been wrong since you crossed the tree line. Not slightly wrong. Wrong in a way that changes direction every 30 meters, cycling through variations with no consistent bearing. This is Aokigahara, and the compass malfunction is not disputed. The Japanese government's own geological surveys confirm it. The lava subsoil beneath 3,500 hectares on the northwest slope of Mount Fuji is rich in magnetite, an iron-bearing volcanic mineral that generates localized magnetic fields strong enough to deflect compass, needles, and corrupt electronic navigation. GPS signals fail inside the forest because magnetite interference and near-impenetrable canopy combine to block satellite positioning. The prefecture's documented patrol protocol doesn't rely on instruments. It uses rope lines and flagging tape, because instruments cannot be trusted. That's not a ghost hunter's account. That's the procedure of the prefectural police department. Aokigahara formed on the lava flows from Mount Fuji's 864 CE eruption. The basalt substructure beneath the forest is riddled with tunnels and hollow cavern systems, many of them unmapped. In sections where canopy closes completely, midday light doesn't reach the ground. In the cavern-laced sections closer to the mountain, the ground is hollow for 6 or 7 meters beneath the surface. Falls through concealed openings don't necessarily produce sounds that carry. The magnetic anomaly data is where the official record becomes instructive. A 2019 study by researchers at Yamanashi University, receiving partial government funding, mapped the magnetic field distribution across the full 3,500 hectares using updated sensor arrays and published the results in a Japanese geology journal. The magnetic anomalies, the study found, don't distribute uniformly. They cluster in specific zones that don't correspond to the locations of known lava tubes or mapped subsurface caverns. There are sections of anomalously strong disruption where the known geology should produce weaker readings. The researchers describe this as consistent with uncharted subsurface features of significant scale and recommended follow-up surveying. That follow-up has not been announced. The government's management of the forest is carefully layered. Signs at the boundary urge reconsideration. Cameras were installed at access points. Photography in specific sections is prohibited by ordinance. Night entry is officially discouraged. The body recovery statistics were removed from public reporting in 2010. Prefectural officials, when asked why, cited unnecessary public attention. Since 2010, no alternative monitoring framework has been announced. The operations continue. The records exist. They are not released. The forest's association with deliberate death predates modern record-keeping by more than a millennium. In the Heian period, Aokigahara became linked to ubasute, the alleged abandonment of elderly relatives during famine. Whether widespread or largely mythological, the association embedded itself specifically in this forest. Japanese folklore places the spirits of those who died in grief or rage inside the trees. Local Buddhist monks perform annual memorial rites throughout the forest. When asked about specific trees, they describe certain ones as troubled. They don't elaborate. Government-funded research identified a significant subsurface anomaly in 2019. The follow-up that the researchers recommended has received no announcement. A 3,500-hectare forest with confirmed magnetite-driven compass disruption, unmapped hollow cavern systems, and now identified clusters of unexplained magnetic intensity in zones that don't match the known subsurface map has, according to the public record, prompted no further investigation. The statistics that would indicate the scale of what happens in the forest have been removed. The study that found something new in the forest has been followed by silence. What are the uncharted subsurface features that produce the anomalous magnetic clustering identified in the 2019 study? Why did government-funded research document a significant finding and receive no announced follow-up? And what, specifically, do the monks performing memorial rites in Aokigahara mean when they describe certain trees as troubled and then say nothing more? From the Sea of Trees, we cross to mainland China, where a government has sealed a forest for over 70 years, and where 11 personnel sent to investigate it across 4 separate expeditions have not returned. Number 3. The Black Bamboo Grove, Sichuan, September 4, 1950. Your wildlife biologist Li Keotang, part of a 6-person government expedition sent into the mountains south of Leshan to catalog the region's ecological resources. The mission is routine. Document the wildlife, map the plant species, report back to the ministry. Your last radio transmission is logged at 9:17 in the morning. You and the 5 people with you are never heard from again. This is the Black Bamboo Grove, and Li Keotang's team was the first of 4 government expeditions sent in. Across 4 attempts, 11 people entered. None came back. The grove covers approximately 30 square kilometers of remote mountain valley in Sichuan province. The black-stemmed bamboo grows to 20 meters in height, forming a canopy so dense that aerial photography cannot penetrate it. The forest floor beneath is karst limestone, a landscape of sinkholes, concealed cave openings, and sheer subsurface drops hidden under vegetation. In poor visibility, the terrain is genuinely lethal. Sounds are absorbed. Orientation is difficult. The Chinese government's explanation for the 1950 disappearance was terrain accident. 6 scientists unfamiliar with karst conditions, poor light, concealed rock openings. Tragic, but explicable. The file was restricted because the early communist government didn't publicize scientific failures during national reconstruction. That explanation holds for 1950. The 1966 expedition was different. 3 experienced mountain surveyors, fully trained in karst terrain, entered with rope equipment, signal flares, a topographic map produced from boundary surveys, radio equipment, and a check-in schedule. The first scheduled check-in passed without contact. The second passed. A rescue team entered the grove's perimeter and found the camp correctly established. Equipment present. Personal effects present. No sign of struggle, animal activity, or weather event. No distress signal had been transmitted. The surveyors had walked in, set up camp correctly, and were not in it. The Chinese military conducted an aerial survey of the grove in the 1970s using infrared and radar imaging. The results are classified. They have not been released under any subsequent government transparency measure. What civilian satellite databases show of the zone is, by itself, unusual. The grove appears as a region of uniform spectral signature that doesn't match the surrounding bamboo forests, reflecting electromagnetic radiation in a narrow band that Chinese forestry satellite researchers have described in published papers as anomalous vegetation spectral characteristics. Of uncertain origin, they attribute it to the specific bamboo species. No independent verification of that attribution has been conducted, because no civilian researcher has been permitted entry since 1967. Local mountain communities in Sichuan have their own name for the grove. It translates approximately as the place that swallows. They describe fog appearing inside it independently of weather conditions elsewhere on the mountain. They describe sounds from the direction of the grove without visible source. These accounts go back multiple generations, documented by Sichuan anthropologists before the 1950 expedition existed, before the Chinese state had any administrative presence in that valley. The traditional name wasn't constructed in response to what happened to Li Keotang's team. It was already there. The Chinese government has logged, dammed, and industrialized virtually every other challenging landscape in Sichuan province in the past 70 years. The Black Bamboo Grove remains untouched. No resource extraction has been proposed for it. No scientific survey has been announced. The military restriction established in 1967 has never been lifted, revised, or publicly justified. For a government that has consistently demonstrated willingness to impose infrastructure on difficult terrain when it judges the value sufficient, the decision to leave 30 square kilometers of mountain valley entirely alone with no stated reason is itself a kind of statement. What did the 1970s military aerial survey find inside the groove that classified its results indefinitely? What produces the satellite spectral anomaly that no independent researcher has been permitted to verify? And what was present in that correctly established camp that 3 fully equipped mountain surveyors walked away from without transmitting a single word? From China's sealed mountain forest, we move to one of the most contested borders on the planet, where 2 nuclear powers have independently created forbidden zones around the same high-altitude forest, and where neither has ever offered a public reason. Number 4. Konka La Pass Forest, Ladakh, 1962. The Sino-Indian War has ended in a ceasefire that left the Himalayan border redrawn by force. In the negotiations that follow, something unusual happens in one specific section of the line of actual control, near the Konka La Pass, at 5,100 meters. Both sides agree to leave a buffer zone, not a patrolled zone, not a surveyed zone, a zone that neither the Indian Army nor the People's Liberation Army enters, that neither side permits civilian access to from any direction, and that neither government surveys from the ground. The Changpa nomads, who have grazed their yaks through these passes for centuries, are turned back. The agreement doesn't appear in any public treaty. It is acknowledged only in administrative correspondence that neither government has declassified. The Konka La restricted zone sits in the Changchenmo Valley remote high-altitude terrain where sparse Himalayan juniper forest and alpine meadow extend across ground that, by every normal standard of geopolitical logic, is not worth extraordinary administrative effort to restrict. Cold, oxygen-depleted, inaccessible borderlands don't typically prompt 2 nuclear rivals to coordinate their exclusion policies without a public agreement, unless something there is equally inconvenient to acknowledge from both sides. Indian Army records from the 1960s and 1970s, portions of which were obtained through right-to-information requests filed by Indian journalists, describe repeating incidents in the Konka La area that soldiers classified in unit logs as unidentified aerial phenomena, not isolated sightings. Repeating events across different years, different personnel rotations, and different observation posts along the same stretch of border. The accounts describe objects rising from the mountain terrain without aircraft behavior and objects descending from altitude and disappearing into the ground. The language is careful military phrasing. It describes, it doesn't speculate. The descriptions are consistent across units that had no documented contact with each other's reports. On the Chinese side, Xinhua published a brief item in 2004 acknowledging that the People's Liberation Army had documented what it described as unusual atmospheric optical phenomena in the Konka La region. The report was removed from Xinhua's online archive shortly after publication. Screenshots taken by researchers before the removal confirm its content. Since 2004, Chinese official commentary on the Konka La has been uniformly absent. The Changpa people of Ladakh have been in this landscape for all of their recorded history. Their name for the Konka La region translates approximately as the place where the underground people come out. This is not a name adopted in response to the army incidents. It appears in ethnographic records compiled by anthropologists in the early 20th century, before the 1962 war restricted civilian movement through the area. The Changpa describe entities that emerge from the mountain terrain, observe their herds, and return downward. They describe these entities not as threatening, but as indifferent. That account predates every military report in the file by several decades. Both the Indian Geological Survey and Chinese geological agencies have published minimal subsurface data on the Konka La area. What exists suggests a deep fault system with associated mineral deposits that produce measurable electromagnetic signatures at the surface. The full electromagnetic map has never been completed by civilian researchers because civilian researchers cannot access the zone. Equipment malfunction, compass unreliability, and localized radio disruption have been reported by Indian Army units in the area, the same category of effects documented at Hoia-Baciu and Aokigahara, on 3 different continents, in 3 different geological environments. The logic of the joint restriction is straightforward. Border security doesn't require both sides to stay out. A threat on one side doesn't require the other side to withdraw. Ecological protection doesn't need military administration. The only thing that requires 2 adversarial governments to maintain simultaneous, uncommunicated exclusion from their respective directions is something that both find equally impossible to frame publicly. So both chose the same alternative: say nothing, keep everyone out, and maintain the arrangement without acknowledging it exists. What did the Indian and Chinese armies independently document in the Conca Law that produced consistent reports across separate units and separate decades? What subsurface geological feature produces the measured electromagnetic signatures at 5,100 meters? And what did the Changpa mean, in the generations before any army ever arrived, by the underground people? From the high Himalayas, we travel south to the Amazon basin, where a government restricts entry to a forest for reasons that are fully documented and fully humane, and where what's been found at the edges makes the full picture considerably harder to ignore. Number 5. Amazon Funai Forbidden Zones. Acre State, 2008. You're a field agent for Funai, Brazil's National Indian Foundation, preparing for a controlled flyover above a section of forest where no government official has stood on the ground in over a decade. Your mission is health monitoring from altitude. Assess whether the people below show signs of illness, without making contact. The people you can see from the aircraft, who are clearly aware of your plane, have never spoken to anyone from the outside world. You don't know their language. You don't know their population. You know only that their ancestors have lived in this forest since before the written record began, and that the last time outsiders made deliberate contact with a tribe like this one, that tribe was functionally gone within 5 years. This is the Funai Forbidden Zone system, and it is one of the few entries on this list where the government's reason for keeping people out is documented, transparent, and medically validated, which makes what has been found at its edges considerably harder to set aside. Brazil's National Indian Foundation maintains a network of legally designated isolated Indian territories, areas where uncontacted or minimally contacted indigenous groups are protected from outside interference by federal law. Entry without Funai authorization carries penalties of up to 6 years imprisonment. The restriction applies equally to researchers, journalists, missionaries, and resource extraction companies. Funai's own field teams enter only under controlled conditions designed to prevent any chance of unintended contact. The medical rationale is documented and historically consistent. Isolated groups carry no acquired immunity to common outside pathogens. Across every recorded contact event in Amazon history, the pattern is the same. Within 5 years, mortality rates among previously isolated communities have ranged from 30 to 90%. From diseases as ordinary as influenza and measles. The restriction exists because the documented alternative is biological extermination that can begin with a handshake. What makes the forbidden zones scientifically significant beyond their humanitarian purpose is what aerial and satellite surveys have found within them. In 2008, Brazilian archaeologist Ana Roosevelt and her team used LiDAR mapping technology laser sensors that penetrate forest canopy to image the ground surface and found geometric earthworks beneath the Amazon that nobody had been able to see from the forest floor. The scale was unexpected. Circular and rectangular enclosures hundreds of meters across, raised causeways connecting distant locations, agricultural terracing in areas that had been classified as primary wilderness. The forest wasn't untouched. It was the reforested surface of something built. Funai and Brazil's National Institute for Space Research expanded LiDAR operations after 2008. A 2018 paper published in Nature estimated that the pre-Columbian Amazon held between 8 and 10 million people at its peak, organized in settled communities with managed agriculture and long-distance infrastructure. The forest that Funai currently protects as isolated indigenous territory is, by the physical evidence beneath it, the reforested ruins of one of the largest pre-Columbian civilizations in the Americas. The isolated tribes inside the forbidden zones are the biological and cultural descendants of that civilization's survivors. What they carry in agricultural technique, in forest management, in oral memory, is the last living record of a society that most history books ignored, because most history books assumed the Amazon was always empty. Funai rangers conducting monitoring operations have documented evidence that some tribes are maintaining sophisticated forest management inherited from the pre-Columbian period. Specific species distributions, maintained path systems, soil modifications inconsistent with purely hunter-gatherer activity. These practices have been running for 500 years since outside contact ended. What knowledge system sustains them is accessible to no one outside the zones. The humanitarian restriction is legally justified and defensible on every relevant ground. The knowledge inside may be irreplaceable. The combination produces a situation where the most significant living archive of pre-Columbian civilization in the Americas is permanently inaccessible for entirely good reasons, while the government maintaining the restriction has consistently declined to frame it in those terms, publicly. What do the isolated communities of the Amazon Forbidden Zones preserve from the civilization of 10 million that preceded them? What do the LiDAR surveys conducted since 2010 show that haven't appeared in published form? And who decided that the reforested ruins of a pre-Columbian urban world should be presented to the public as untouched wilderness? From the Amazon's living archive, we cross the Atlantic to Europe, where the continent's last primeval forest sits on a contested border, and where a 2017 legal crisis showed that certain governments will absorb significant international consequences rather than let particular sections of an ancient forest be examined. Number 6. Bialowieza, Primeval Forest. 2017. You're a European Union environmental inspector, and you've just been handed internal Polish government documents showing that the country's forestry service has been logging inside the Bialowieza Strict Nature Reserve for 2 years. The trees being removed include specimens over 400 years old. The EU has issued emergency injunctions. Poland has acknowledged them and continued. The European Court of Justice has ruled the logging illegal. The Forestry Ministry has continued. You start to wonder what, precisely, the government is so determined to do inside a forest it has spent decades telling the world is irreplaceable. Bialowieza straddles the Poland-Belarus border across roughly 1,500 square kilometers. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and the last significant remnant of the primeval lowland forest that once covered most of northern Europe before Bronze Age land clearance began. Its oldest sections contain trees over 500 years old, standing through the rise and fall of multiple kingdoms. It holds the only wild population of European bison, a species that was extinct in the wild by 1927 and was rebuilt from zoo stock using Bialowieza as the restoration site. In the specific language of conservation biology, the forest is irreplaceable. Its ecological relationships took millennia to form and cannot be recreated if destroyed. The EU's scientific assessment of the bark beetle infestation, the Polish government cited as justification, found the infestation within normal parameters for a primeval ecosystem. Old-growth forests regulate insect populations through their own dynamics. Intervention wasn't ecologically necessary, per EU scientists. When the European Court of Justice issued its halt order, the Polish Forestry Ministry accelerated the rate of removal before enforcement mechanisms could be activated. That response to speed up rather than pause when a court order arrives is the behavior of an institution working against a deadline. Documents released during the EU legal proceedings showed that the logging zones overlapped with areas flagged in the government's own environmental impact assessments for a proposed highway along the forest's edge. The EIA had identified potential archaeological sites in those zones that had not yet been excavated. Internal Forestry Ministry communications, obtained by Polish environmental journalists during the court proceedings, showed explicit discussion of managing findings in certain sections before international survey teams arrived. That phrase, managing findings, appears in the official correspondence without elaboration. Its context is unexcavated potential archaeological material in the zones being actively logged. The primeval forest floor is why this matters beyond ecology. Białowieza's undisturbed soil layers function as a continuous stratigraphic record. Organic material, pollen sequences, wooden structures, and cultural artifacts beneath old-growth trees in a forest that has never been logged can survive in archaeological context for thousands of years. When that surface layer is stripped for timber, the archive is destroyed permanently and without recovery. If there were sites in those logged zones, structures, deposits, material culture predating any written record, and the logging reached them before survey teams arrived, whatever was there is gone. The EU logging prohibition on the Polish side is now enforced. The highway proposal was withdrawn. The ministry communications about managing findings have not been followed by any official statement about what was or was not found in those zones before the prohibition took effect. On the Belarus side, the picture remains separately unresolved. The interior section of Bialowieza, nearest the Polish border, has been a military exclusion zone since the Soviet period. It has never been subject to independent scientific survey. No statement from the Belarusian government explains what military administration serves in a section of ancient forest where no strategic interest is obvious. The two halves of the forest sit on opposite sides of a border and opposite sides of a disclosure problem. One government logged specific zones while resisting international oversight. The other maintains military control over adjacent territory without explanation. Between them, the primeval floor of Europe's last ancient woodland holds its record in silence. What archaeological material in Białowieża's protected zones prompted the Polish government to absorb EU sanctions rather than permit a survey? What do the internal communications about managing findings refer to specifically? And what does the Belarusian military administration of the primeval forest's interior serve that a national park designation could not? From Europe's ancient forest floor, we fly to the opposite end of the earth, where a rainforest older than the dinosaurs is governed by a restriction that the Australian government and its traditional custodians both enforce, and neither has fully explained. Number 7. Daintree Rainforest, Far North Queensland, 2016. You're a botanist from James Cook University, first day of a permitted research survey. Your permit took 14 months to obtain. It covers a specific corridor designated jointly by the Queensland Government and the Kuku-Yalanji traditional owners, marked precisely on a map you've signed. There is no physical fence between what you may enter and what you may not, but the cultural protocol you've agreed to is explicit, and your Kuku-Yalanji liaison makes it clearer in person on the first morning. When you ask what's in the restricted sections, he looks at you with an expression that is patient and complete, and he says, "Things that have been there longer than we have." In the most literal scientific sense, he is correct. The Daintree covers approximately 1,200 square kilometers in the Cape York Peninsula. It is the world's oldest surviving tropical rainforest, 135 million years in age, established during the Cretaceous period before the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. Roughly 3,000 plant species found in the Daintree occur nowhere else on Earth. 30% of Australia's frog species, 60% of its bat species, and 40% of its bird species are represented within it. The wet tropics of Queensland, of which the Daintree is the core, was listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1988. The restriction system is layered deliberately. Queensland National Park regulations establish outer boundaries and designated access corridors. Indigenous land use agreements with the Kuku-Yalanji, negotiated under Australian federal law, create additional restricted zones within those boundaries, requiring traditional authority approval to enter. The innermost sections, the ones that haven't been surveyed or accessed in decades, are protected simultaneously by statutory regulation and customary law. The combination is designed to be total. The Kuku-Yalanji have occupied the Daintree region for at least 9,000 years based on archaeological evidence at the forest edge. Their ceremonial knowledge and oral traditions predate that record by an unknown margin. The restricted intersections contain Quincon sites, areas of sacred significance associated with the Quincons, powerful entities in Kuku-Yalanji tradition. The restriction is not framed, within that tradition, as protecting people from the Quincons. It is framed as protecting the Quincons from people. The direction of the concern is reversed entirely, and the Kuku-Yalanji have maintained that framing consistently across all documented interactions with researchers and government bodies. In the permitted outer sections, researchers from the Australian Tropical Herbarium have documented an average of 6 previously undescribed plant species per year for the past decade. 6 new species annually in the accessible portions. Species unchanged since before the mass extinction event 66 million years ago are still growing in the Daintree's permitted zones. The ecological gradient in a forest of this age runs inward. The less disturbed the section, the more extraordinary its biological content. The restricted interior is, by that logic, among the least characterized ecosystems accessible on land anywhere on the planet. In 2021, a LiDAR survey of permitted areas near the forest's eastern boundary detected subsurface structural anomalies at 3 separate locations. Queensland's Department of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships described them as consistent with possible archaeological significance. The data was shared with the Hoia-Baciu Council. Their documented response was not at this time. The anomalies have not been excavated. Their nature is uncharacterized. The Hoia-Baciu have the legal authority under federal law to make that decision, and they have made it, and the department's correspondence records it without comment. A 135-million-year-old rainforest that has survived every mass extinction in terrestrial history, the end Cretaceous impact, the Eocene thermal maximum, the Pleistocene glacial maximum that rendered most of Australia arid, holds biological information of a kind that exists nowhere else on land. What the restricted interior contains, biologically and archaeologically, is a question the Hoia-Baciu Council has determined is not currently theirs to open. That determination is legally binding. Whether the 2021 LiDAR anomalies are archaeology, geology, or something else is a question that may not have a public answer in any time frame research institutions would recognize as normal. What do the subsurface anomalies detected in the 2021 LiDAR survey represent? What does the Hoia-Baciu Council hold about the forest's restricted interior that makes them decline further investigation? And in a forest 135 million years old, what is still living in the sections that haven't been entered in any recorded memory? From the Cretaceous archive of far north Queensland, we travel north to peninsular Malaysia and a forest even older, where the silence in the restricted interior is, according to official government records, not silent at all. Number 8. Taman Negara, Pahang, 1991. Your British botanist Edward Whitmore, who has spent 30 years studying the rainforests of Southeast Asia and published 17 peer-reviewed papers on this forest specifically. Your permit to access the interior sections has just been declined for renewal. The Forestry Department's letter gives no reason beyond restricted access zone. You write back requesting clarification. No reply comes. You spend the next 3 years filing formal inquiries through academic institutions and government liaison channels, trying to establish what the restriction is based on and whether any appeal process exists. Nobody tells you. The interior of the forest you've spent a career studying remains, by formal government decision, outside what you're permitted to see. Taman Negara covers 4,343 square kilometers of peninsular Malaysia's interior, established in 1938. It sits on a geological basement of Paleozoic rock over 300 million years old. The rainforest growing on that foundation is 130 million years in age, older than most of the world's current mountain ranges, older than the Atlantic Ocean in its modern form. The ecological relationships inside it have had time to develop a complexity that younger ecosystems, regardless of their size or protection status, simply cannot replicate. The restriction structure parallels the Daintree, but at larger scale. Malaysian federal law recognizes the customary land rights of the Orang Asli communities within the park. The Batak people, who have maintained continuous interior habitation for at least 10,000 years based on archaeological evidence, hold traditional authority over the intersections. Malaysian Park Administration and Batak customary law together restrict those sections from outsider entry. The combination is enforced in practice by armed forest rangers. The Batak's oral traditions describe the interior forest as the domain of the Tohan, a term rendered variously by researchers as spirit beings, guardians, or those who were here first. The translation matters less than the consistency. Across different Batak family groups occupying different geographic portions of the park, the same prohibition is encoded in the same terms. The interior is not merely dangerous or difficult. It is categorically unavailable, in a way that has structured Batak life continuously for as long as their memory extends. That prohibition predates the historical record entirely. Malaysian park rangers conducting emergency operations in the most restricted interior zones, searches for lost tourists, monitoring of suspected poaching, have filed internal reports documenting what they describe as unusual acoustic phenomena. Sounds recorded in those zones that correspond to no known species in the Malaysian Biodiversity Inventory. These reports exist in Forest Department files. They were publicly referenced for the first time in a 2017 parliamentary question about Taman Negara's management. The government's documented response to that question, biodiversity documentation in restricted zones, is ongoing. No timeline was provided. No data from that effort has been released. The biodiversity gradient makes its own argument. In a permitted survey zone near the park's southeastern boundary in 2019, a Malaysian university research team documented 18 previously undescribed arthropod species in a single 3-month survey period. 18 new species in one accessible edge section in one season. The forest interior, in continuous ecological stability for 130 million years, with minimal human disturbance in its most restricted sections, has never been systematically surveyed. The species assemblage within it cannot, by the logic of the gradient, be less extraordinary than what's being found at the accessible perimeter. The acoustic phenomena in the ranger's reports, the BATEC's categorical prohibition, the government's non-answer to direct parliamentary inquiry, and 18 new species found in 3 months at the park's accessible edge combine into a picture that is not dramatic, but is specific. Something is documented. Multiple independent sources, traditional knowledge maintained across generations, professional observation in official files, and basic ecological reasoning all point to the same interior location. The response from institutions responsible for that location has been, consistently, no further information. A 130-million-year-old forest ecosystem in one of the least disturbed sections of Southeast Asia is, by any measure, one of the most significant uncharacterized environments on land. Whether the decision to leave it uncharacterized represents conservation discipline or something else remains, officially, an open question that the 2017 parliamentary record shows no one in authority is currently answering. What do the acoustic phenomena in the ranger's internal reports represent, and why has announced biodiversity documentation of restricted zones produced no released data? What does the BATEC prohibition preserve about the interior that makes it categorically different from the rest of the forest? And what would 18 new species per season at the edge imply about what no survey team has entered? From Malaysia's undocumented interior, we return to Europe, where a far smaller and in certain ways stranger forbidden zone sits in a forest in western Poland. No classified files, no missing expeditions, no traditional prohibitions, just a government fence around something 50 years of scientific inquiry has not explained. Number 9. The Crooked Forest, Gryfino, Western Poland, 1981. You're a forestry technician making routine measurements in a pine stand near Nozarnovo, and what's in front of you is making you doubt your instruments. The trees around you grew upward normally from the ground to roughly 25 centimeters. Then, at that precise height, every single one makes an abrupt 90-degree bend northward. They grow horizontally for about a meter. Then they curve back and continue upward. All 400 trees. The same bend height, the same direction, the same degree of turn. You look at the surrounding pines, planted in the same period, growing straight. You measure again. Same result. You put your notebook away and walk back to the road, and you don't mention the bend measurements in your report that day. There is nothing dramatic here. No electromagnetic readings exceeding background levels. No missing expeditions, no classified files, no ancient prohibitions. Just 400 pine trees bent at the same height, in the same direction, in a fenced grove in western Poland, and 50 years of intermittent scientific attention has not produced a peer-reviewed explanation for how they got that way. The Crooked Forest consists of approximately 400 Scots pines planted around 1930 in Nozarnovo near Gryfino. The trees were 7 to 10 years old, young saplings, when something acted on them. The intervention point is consistent across the entire stand, approximately 25 to 30 centimeters of height, representing 7 to 10 years of growth. After whatever happened, all 400 trees curved back to vertical and continued growing normally. The J-shaped profile is present in every tree in the stand and in none of the surrounding pines planted in the same period. The bend direction is north, without exception. Polish forestry authorities have fenced off the core stand and restricted access to marked pathways. Scientific work within the grove requires department approval. The official explanation on record is cause unknown, not a placeholder pending research. After 50 years of study by Polish forestry institutions, no peer-reviewed paper has been published with a confirmed cause. The heavy snow theory is the most commonly cited candidate. If snow accumulated on young saplings and bent them under weight during a severe winter, growth might have distorted. But snow-bent trees don't recover uniformly. They fracture, grow at irregular angles, reflecting how each individual tree failed, or die. They don't all bend to the same height, turn to the same degree, and resume vertical growth at the same point. A snow event doesn't behave with that consistency across 400 individuals at once. The human manipulation theory proposes that the trees were deliberately trained in the 1930s by German settlers in western Poland, who had carpentry traditions requiring curved timber for ship frames or agricultural equipment. Trained timber cultivation was a documented practice, but it required ongoing physical intervention, individual saplings guided and held in position over growing seasons. When the German population was displaced by the Second World War, any such program would have ended abruptly. The uniform recovery of all 400 trees to vertical growth and the precision of the bend height across the entire stand is difficult to reconcile with individual manual work interrupted mid-program. A geomagnetic anomaly affecting growth tropism in the young trees has been explored. No published measurement of the Grafino area has confirmed magnetic field variation comparable to what's documented elsewhere in this investigation. If an anomaly existed, it hasn't been detected by available instruments. If it no longer exists, no record of when it stopped has been found. Sometimes the most unsettling outcome is not suppression or conspiracy or ancient warning. It is a circle of bent trees and a scientific establishment that examined them for half a century and arrived at nothing. The forestry department maintains the fence. It offers cause unknown as its standing position. The question of how 400 trees bent simultaneously to the same height in the same direction and then grew normally, as if nothing had happened, remains open in the most complete sense. Not classified, not disputed, not pursued, simply unanswered. What force acted simultaneously on all 400 trees at the same growth height and then stopped? Why does the bend direction hold consistently north across the entire stand? And why has the question of how it happened not produced a single peer-reviewed answer in 50 years? From bent pines and no answer, we end where ancient mysteries most often find their final form in West Africa, in a grove where the Nigerian government keeps people out not because it doesn't understand what's there, but because the grove has made its own position clear. Number 10. Osun-Osogbo Sacred Grove, Osogbo, Nigeria, 1953. Your Austrian scholar Uli Bayer, one of the first European researchers to study Yoruba art seriously, and you've just been permitted into the outer sections of a forest grove on the banks of the Osun River. Your guide, a member of the Osogbo royal household, walks you through the protocols with exact precision. These sections you may enter. These you may observe but not photograph. These you may not enter at all. When you ask about the innermost sections, the ones near the primary shrine at the river, his explanation is direct. Those belong to Osun, not symbolically. He uses the word the way you'd describe a private residence. If you enter without invitation, he says, she will handle it herself. He doesn't elaborate. He doesn't need to. This is the Osun-Osogbo Sacred Grove, and the question of what Osun's handling of uninvited visitors means, whether it is metaphor, cultural framework, or something the available evidence doesn't fully categorize, has occupied researchers for 70 years without resolution. The grove covers 75 hectares of forest on the Osun River in Osogbo, capital of Nigeria's Osun State. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, designated in 2005, and one of the last surviving primary sacred groves of a tradition that was once standard across Yoruba communities in southwestern Nigeria. The Yoruba understand the natural world as inhabited by orishas, divine forces that are both individual entities and aspects of a single creative principle. The Osun River and the grove surrounding it are the domain of Osun, the orisha of rivers, healing, and fertility. The grove is not a site of worship in the sense of a dedicated building. It is understood in Yoruba tradition as her residence. The distinction is not metaphorical. The administrative structure at Osun-Osogbo has no direct parallel elsewhere in this investigation. UNESCO oversight provides international legal framework. Osun state government provides administrative structure. The Osogbo Royal Council and the Atauja, the King of Osogbo, hold traditional authority over access protocols. And the Arugba, a young woman selected by divination to serve as the sacred vessel during the annual festival, holds a ritual status that supersedes all administrative hierarchies when they conflict. The Nigerian government's documented position is that when UNESCO guidelines and traditional authority come into tension, traditional authority governs access to the inner sanctum. This is the stated position of a federal government agency in published heritage management documentation. The inner sanctum, the area surrounding the primary shrine at the river, is accessible only during the annual Osun-Osogbo festival and only to specific ritual participants. Researchers, journalists, and government representatives remain in the outer sections. UNESCO's advisory notes for the site acknowledge exclusive traditional custodianship in accordance with spiritual protocols. No academic study of what happens at the inner shrine exists, because no academic observer has been permitted to be present. The accounts that do exist are consistent across generations and are not for general publication by determination of the traditional authority. What makes the restriction scientifically notable beyond its legal dimensions is what ecologists working in the outer sections have documented about the grove's behavior. The species assemblages found in the 75 hectares of Osun-Osogbo do not correspond to what ecological modeling predicts for an urban forest fragment of that size and degree of isolation. The grove is surrounded by the growing city of Osogbo on every side. Its boundary, maintained by ritual practice rather than any physical barrier, has remained ecologically intact. The biodiversity inside behaves as though the grove is connected to a much larger, contiguous ecosystem that doesn't exist in any adjacent area. What sustains that coherence in a fragment this small, this embedded in an urban environment, is not accounted for by standard models. In 1991, Austrian artist and Yoruba cultural researcher Suzanne Wenger, who had converted to Yoruba traditional religion and was known in Osogbo as Aduni Olorisha, received permission to spend extended time near the inner shrine as part of her long collaboration with traditional authorities on the grove's artistic restoration. She spent 17 years leading the renewal of the grove's sacred sculptures. Her published accounts from that period described the inner grove as having a quality she consistently declined to characterize scientifically. She stated that the experience was not reducible to cultural conditioning or religious preparation. She recommended approaching within traditional protocol or not at all. Suzanne Wenger was precise about everything she studied and documented. About the inner grove, she chose a different kind of precision. She said what it was not and left the rest unsaid. 10 forests. 10 governments maintaining boundaries around 10 locations where the official record runs out before the question does. The Hoia-Baciu clearing where nothing grows and a Securitate file closes without conclusions. Aokigahara's classified subsurface survey and the statistics a government removed rather than explained. The Black Bamboo Groove and 11 people across 4 expeditions who didn't return. Konkala, jointly restricted by nuclear rivals who have never agreed on anything else. The Amazon zones, protecting the last living memory of 10 million. Bialowieza and the ministry communications about managing findings before international eyes arrived. The Daintree's 135 million year interior and the anomalies a traditional council chose not to excavate. Taman Negara's sounds with no known source and a parliamentary non-answer. The Crooked Forest's 400 bent pines and 50 years of nothing. And Osun-Osogbo, where a federal government defers to a grove that a precise and careful scholar spent 17 years near and then chose not to describe. The forests stay forbidden, the questions accumulate. Whatever is inside them grows in the quiet, and the governments that hold the gates have made clear they intend to keep them. If you've stayed this far, tell us in the comments which of these you'd enter first if the restrictions lifted. Subscribe for more investigations into the places the record doesn't reach. And wherever you're watching from, drop your country below.